Welcome, everybody, to this week's live event with Wild Alaskan Company. I'm Kat. I'm part of the Wild Alaskan Company recipe team. Today is one of my favorite recipes to make because it's so minimal and so delicious. It's a very lovely dish with seared Pacific halibut and served in a creamy peppercorn sauce. It's inspired by a classic French bistro sauce that's called au poivre. Usually, au poivre is served with steak, but we're going to use Pacific halibut. Happens to be a really, really delicious pairing. I'm using a fillet of Pacific halibut today, and I really have loved using Pacific halibut steaks in the past. I haven't had that in my freezer in a minute, but both of those are really good options for this recipe. Just to reintroduce this recipe, the recipe of the week is seared halibut with a creamy peppercorn sauce, something that is called au poivre. It's a riff on a French bistro classic, which poivre means peppers. So it's literally a peppercorn sauce. And if you don't love peppercorns, this might not be the sauce for you, but you can always pull back on the peppercorns and still have a really nice creamy sauce to serve over the fish. I really like using this sauce for Pacific halibut because it's probably what I like to describe as the steakiest whitefish. And what I mean, it has like the most meaty texture. It's the heartiest flake. I've tried this with salmon as well, coho and sockeye. Equally delicious. So you really can mix and match the fish that you're using. I just happen to be using Pacific halibut today, and I especially like using halibut steaks when I have them in my freezer. So the recipe feels a little bit like a special occasion meal because it's just a little bit indulgent with a creamy sauce. We got heavy cream in a mug. We've got some miso paste here, which I actually have dissolved with some water. So this is kind of going to be the stand-in for a veggie stock or like the stock element of the sauce. And then we've got peppercorns, which I've already crushed some of these. So I can show you how I did that here in a moment. All of these are going to come together in about 20 minutes. So it's a really, really quick recipe to make, but it feels super fancy. I think it looks fancy just because of the way the sauce looks once it's poured over the fish. It's just really, really decadent. So let me show you all you really need for this. You need a fish spatula, you need a pan, however large, I'm using a single fillet, so I have a very small, relatively small pan here. And this is going to be the exact size I need to sear a fillet of salmon, fillet of halibut, excuse me. I've got a pan preheated over medium-high heat. This is a new cooking surface for me. I usually am cooking on an induction burner at home or over an open flame. So anytime you're using a new surface, you might need to just give a little more time to understand how hot it actually is. A good way to test if the pan is hot enough to sear is something that I don't use very often, which is the water droplet test. So it's going to get a little splash of water here from the sink. If it's hot enough to sear, you should see these little droplets of water bouncing around the surface like a ball. It looks like there's a marble in here. It's very small and probably hard for you to see. But if the pan isn't hot enough, it's not going to dance around like that. It's going to essentially start to evaporate as soon as it hits the surface. So this pan is quite hot, possibly too hot, but it's electric. So we're stuck with the temperature that we're working with here. What I'm going to do now is add a high heat cooking oil. I actually am using ghee, which is clarified butter, technically a cooking fat, I suppose, not an oil, but this is something that should sear really cleanly and not get too browned. But that looks actually like a really good temperature. The ghee is smoking a little bit, which is what we are looking for when we're searing fish. And then once that is a little bit preheated and spread around on the pan, I'm going to add my fillet of Pacific halibut. I've already patted it dry. That is really important anytime you're searing because if you don't, it's going to stick. But this is nice and dry now. I'm going to add it away from me so it doesn't spatter. And it should start to sear immediately, sizzling around the edges here. A little smoky, but not burning. And we're just gonna let this do its thing for the next, let's say 3 minutes or so. As I'm swirling some of the fat around, if you're not used to searing, just know that you are gonna get hit with some splatters of hot scalding fat, but as long as you're tipping the pan away from you, you should be out of the range of getting hit by the worst little droplets here. But overall, it looks like this is gonna sear up really beautifully. And another note, if you're new to searing, you're probably gonna be very anxious because at this point, this is sticking to the pan 100%. It's totally glued on there. And all we need to do though is wait. The fish will tell us when it's ready to be flipped. It'll start to basically sear itself off from the surface of the pan. And it should be relatively easy to flip after that 3 or 4 minute mark. Once it gets a nice golden crust forming, it just does its magical thing and starts to release from the metal. So one thing I showed you earlier in my very fancy mug was this miso water. When you're making a classic au poivre sauce for a French bistro style meal, you're typically going to use beef stock. We're using miso paste here because it has a really nice, savory, rich umami flavor that kind of replicates the things that I think of when I think of beef stock, but it's pescatarian friendly. So a little bit lighter. I think it pairs really nicely with seafood because it's not as potent as beef stock, but gives you all of those really nice savory qualities. If you don't have miso paste at home though, that's okay. What I would suggest is using veggie stock with a splash of soy sauce in there to give it a really nice seasoned umami savory flavor. You can just do that to taste. I find that that is another good option. So veggie stock with a splash of soy, just seasoned to taste, or like we're doing here, miso paste whisked with water. I'm not sure if you'll be able to see this on camera, but we have a little bit of a golden edge forming here. And that part of the halibut looks like it's coming up so easily. Actually, all of the halibut is coming up perfectly. I barely had to lift it. So we're just gonna flip it. I'm gonna turn the heat off of my burner here because it is electric. It's gonna stay hot well after I've actually turned off the heat. And the residual heat in this pan should be enough to cook the fish through. Once the fish is cooked through, we're just going to build the sauce right into the pan. And it's going to be really just simple, nice and easy. I just have the seared halibut on a side plate right now. I did take this off of the heat so that this doesn't burn. What I'm going to do is drain some of this excess ghee that you see pooling up here. It's not that it's bad to use, but we're going to be adding liquid to the pan next. And when you're adding liquid to fat, some very splattery things can happen. So you just want to be really careful that you're not, mixing too much water with very hot fat. So we're just going to drain this wherever you're able to drain things. I'm going to drain this right here into a little side cup. You don't need to wipe the pan totally dry. Just limit the amount of fat that you have in there. Next thing we're going to do is add the miso water mixture. And you'll see that it sort of bubbles up a little bit. So I'm going to let this cook down and reduce it so it becomes a little bit thicker. And once it gets to be less watery than it is right now, that's when we'll add in the things like peppercorns, butter, and then eventually we'll add in heavy cream to give it that creaminess. Let's wait till this gets a little bubbly and simmery. In the meantime, actually, what I wanted to show you is for a sauce like this, when you're using peppercorns, you really want the peppercorns to be a prominent ingredient. So I like when they're coarsely ground or crushed. I don't know if all of you have a pepper grinder that has the ability to, adjust how coarse you like it. If you have a mortar and pestle, that's a good way to get things nice and coarse. But the other way to do this is actually just to literally smash it with the back of the pan. So I'm not going to be able to do that with this pan because it's hot. But let's see if I can do that with my little jar here. So this is kind of what you'd want to do with some fresh whole peppercorns on my cutting board. And then you take a back of a pan and kind of just smash it. And you'll see that starts to happen. This is not totally a flat surface, so that's why the back of a pan is really good because it's nice and flat. So we'll clean up these peppercorns later. I feel like it gave everything a little bit more of a Christmas vibe. Black peppercorns are definitely the strongest flavor of peppercorn that you can be adding to a sauce like this. If you'd like something more mellow, I actually would recommend either cutting back on the amount. If you're making enough sauce for 2 people, you're using 2 teaspoons of peppercorns, which is kind of a lot. So you could cut that in half, cut that in a quarter, and just see how things taste. Or alternatively, you can use something like green peppercorns. Those have a much milder flavor, whether you're using dried green peppercorns or green peppercorns that are in a brine. Either of those are really good options. Even these like beautiful pink peppercorns have a milder flavor as well. So black peppercorns for sure, it's potent pepper all the way. So that is looking like it's getting a little bit thicker, which is what I'm loving. The bubbles will start to get a little bit larger. This is sort of like the size of bubble that you're looking for when you're thickening a sauce. Next thing that's going to go in here, let's add in as many of those peppercorns as I can scrape up from my counter. Maybe 3 big pinches, because I love pepper. And then I'm going to add in a pad of butter. So right now in the pan, there wasn't really any fat. So this is the fat element. And we're just going to let this integrate into the sauce. Going to add a really nice richness to it, and it's going to help keep all of these ingredients together, keep them from sort of like separating and pull apart. Yum, it smells so good. Anytime you add butter to anything, it really just is the most delicious smell. So I'm just going to let this combine for one more second. Right now, the peppercorns are starting to infuse in the fat in that stock that's in there, that miso stock that we made. And then I'm going to grab my heavy cream. This is just going to go in until the sauce is thick enough to coat the back of a spoon. So I'll need probably another minute or 2 for this to become the consistency that I'm looking for. Now would also be a good time to check if you want to season it anymore. I would say if you're using miso paste and water as your stock, you might not really need to add too much seasoning because it already has a really nice salty balanced flavor. Or that's tasting perfect to me. The halibut itself, it's nice to give that a light season before it sears. Little sprinkle of salt on the front and back. You might not even need it if you're trying to, limit where you're putting your salt, because this has so much flavor here in the sauce. So right now it's still pretty thin and soupy, as you can see. And we're looking for something that's a little more drizzleable. So I'll let that sit here for a moment. To recap, what we have in here is a little bit of the residual fond, is what it's called, from searing the halibut. Anytime you're searing any sort of vegetable or fish or meat in a pan, a lot of times you're going to be left with a little bit of a golden crust. This less so because it seared really nicely. So that was like the first secret ingredient that's in this pan, is that little residual sear that's left. So on top of that, we added a water miso mixture. If you don't have water and miso, you can add veggie stock here. Actually, there's the option to add a splash of white wine or brandy as well. I didn't have that. Totally okay. Water, miso, then we added butter, peppercorns, and heavy cream. So my pan has 5 ingredients plus that little secret ingredient of any crust that was left from the halibut in the pan, which there was minimal. So, all right. I've got my plate of seared Pacific halibut. So as you can see, this cooked into a nice thick sauce. When you drag a spoon across the bottom, it parts the seeds of sauce, and that's kind of what you're looking for. So you can go ahead and add as little or as much sauce as you like here. I made enough sauce for 2 servings of fish. I find that it's hard to make a single serving of sauce because everything evaporates so quickly. So let's give this a taste, shall we? Perfect little flake at the end here. Make sure I get this nicely covered from all angles. And then, amazing, as always. Bravo, chef. This is so delicious. The halibut was actually perfectly seared. The crust was so nice that I almost couldn't bite through it in the best way possible. And that's it. That is halibut au poivre. Very much something that I would love to order. if I were at a French bistro. Super savory, super delicious, really a nice special meal that came together very quickly. So that's it for today. I will see you next year. We don't have an event over Christmas or New Year's Day. So in the meantime, I really hope you have a lovely rest of the year. Thanks for coming. Live wild, everybody.